Hello everybody, I'm Novi and welcome back to the channel. I'm sure this won't be news to anyone watching, but I'm a huge fan of AEW. I've followed since the beginning and watched since not long after that. In that span, my fandom has gone through many ebbs and flows as any fandom does. Sometimes they'll do things that annoy me to no end, and other times they'll give me exactly what I'm looking for in my pro wrestling in a way that no other promotion can. When it comes to the latter, I'm always feeling that feeling the strongest after one of their pay-per-views. And the reason why is very simple. They're just always fantastic. And they're fantastic at this incredibly consistent level that no other company in the world can match. Which brings me to what I want to get into today, which is talking about why I think pay-per-views are AEW's greatest strength. Before we dive in though, leave a like on the video and subscribe to the channel for live streams every Wednesday before Dynamite and new videos just like these every Saturday, just talking grabs. Before we start gassing up AEW pay-per-views like crazy, I think we should talk about the builds to them first because it's a very valid conversation to be had. Dynasty was a generational show, so generational in fact, it's the reason why I chose to make this video. The matches were of course the best part of the event, with an incredible variety of styles to satisfy every kind of wrestling fan. With that, alongside said matches having the right results throughout the night, except for that one we're not going to mention too much, it was pretty perfect. The thing about that is though, I think the build to the show will be kind of excused when looking back at it because it ended up being so good. And AEW is probably happy about that because it wasn't perfect to say the least. A lot of the lead ups to the matches either felt rushed, like Kyle O'Reilly versus Roderick Strong, or like AEW left money on the table in the case of Swerve versus Joe. Which sucks because the TV would have benefited so much from either of those feuds being fleshed out a whole lot more. Not even just that, I think the matches would have benefited a lot too. I understood them running the big Roddy turns on Kyle angle on Battle of the Belts, but it would have hit so much harder on Dynamite or Collision. The match still ended up being great because of course it did, it's these two in the ring, but I can't help but look back and say they should have done more with that story with these two in particular. That isn't a singular thing either, it's been happening for a while with these AEW pay-per-views. There just always seems to be a couple feuds across the cards that don't end up reaching their full potential, and it bums me out. I know I keep going back to it, but Roddy and Kyle is a great example because they had so much lore they could have tapped into, and they just didn't. If they did, they could have added so much more juice to the match and maybe gotten the crowd more involved from the get-go, even though that didn't really hurt my enjoyment of the match. They for sure can tap into all that story that I mentioned later down the line. I don't think Dynasty is going to be their last match or anything like that, but in a vacuum, looking at this specific moment in time, I think they could have done more with this pairing and just done more for the match overall. Thankfully, they did do the classic AEW pay-per-view thing that I mentioned before, where the match was just so good, you don't really think about this stuff after the fact, but that shouldn't be something you have to lean on every single time. Just to be clear so there aren't any weird like gotcha moments in the comments, not all of the builds to these feuds have this problem, but enough of them do to where I feel like it's a thing worth mentioning when talking about AEW pay-per-views, so there you go, mentioned. The thing about me though is that I try not to say that there's a problem without having at least some kind of solution for it. That is, if it's something that can be solved or, my brain is working. But luckily, this issue can be, and I think AEW is already implementing a way to solve it right now, so I don't have to think of a thing. Their idea is to increase the number of AEW pay-per-views per year to 9, and I think that's the perfect catch-all solution that they were looking for, and I'll tell you why. With the big shows happening almost monthly nowadays, they've completely gotten rid of that lull period that they've struggled to manage over the years. Especially that one between Revolution and Double or Nothing that we would still be sitting in right now if it wasn't for Dynasty. This change also limits the amount of nothing filler TV that they've had to put on, and instead forces them to try their hand at more exciting and dynamic booking week to week. And that's so much easier to watch as a weekly viewer, and it's so much easier to talk about as someone who makes wrestling content, even if the ideas don't always work. To put it in other words, things happening on the pro wrestling shows is fun and enjoyable to watch. Who knew? What it also does though is it lets them get to the big time matches a lot faster and a lot more often, which is great for a company that excels in that department. I get that it's just a slogan, but it's a great slogan because it has a lot of truth to it. AEW is where the best wrestle. And I'd say they proved that when they put together these pay-per-view cards, and even the TV cards for that matter. Just remember that not too long ago, they ran two of their top stars, Kenny Omega and MJF, in a random singles match on Collision, just because MJF was about to beat Kenny's longest title reign record. That could be a potential pay-per-view main event in my opinion, and they just burned the first encounter on free TV. Being comfortable enough to do that is honestly the biggest flex, like, oh, we can just throw this dream match on TV and not really break a sweat about it. And somehow, that's become a normal thing for AEW when, in all honesty, it absolutely shouldn't be. For that, I think I have to give credit to TK, who show after show, time after time, flaunts his biggest strength as a booker: matchmaking. Somehow, I feel like he always manages to find the perfect match to make the shows just hit all that much harder. And when I say shows, I mean TV and pay-per-view, because it happens on both. Of course, let's throw out a few examples just to give a little, analytics back to my claim. We had Ospreay Danielson at Dynasty, Ospreay Takeshita at Revolution, and even Ospreay Claudio from Dynamite to point to. 3 examples that all include Will Ospreay. I mean, it's kind of funny just how that worked out. I didn't do that intentionally, but it is kind of fitting for this channel at the very least. But anyways, I'd say these, and of course other non-Ospreay examples, is what makes AEW so special. You're consistently going to get the best wrestling in the world more often than not, and I think that they've earned that reputation, especially for their pay-per-views. Another issue I see brought up really often that I want to mention is actually in relation to said wrestling matches, and that's the pay-per-view lengths. This is one that I completely understand, because 4 hours of wrestling almost non-stop is a lot, if we're being real. Over the years, AEW has had a bloating issue on their pay-per-view cards that they still struggle to shake. A lot of the times it feels like they're just including matches for the sake of getting guys on the card, even when those matches would have worked a whole lot better on a Dynamite or Collision. On the one hand, I do think it's great that they make sure you get your money's worth with these shows, especially given their absolutely absurd pricing. But on the other, did I really need to see a Jericho Hook match that went 16 minutes on the pay-per-view? Hell no. Surprisingly though, that issue doesn't come down to Jericho individually, even if he is the worst thing on AEW pretty handedly. It's more in relation to the broader issue we see with match lengths across the wrestling world. This is a video about AEW pay-per-view specifically, but this happens throughout all the wrestling promotions' big shows, even the indies. I mean, take for example Naito. They're strolling him out in 30-minute main event bangers when he barely struggles to go for 20. The difference between that and AEW though is that in AEW it kind of feels like a rule that all the matches on the pay-per-view go long as hell. And when all of those matches that are 20 plus minutes long all try to be these grand epics, it hurts the enjoyment of the show overall, because we're just seeing the same formula over and over again. Not to take any stray shots at any specific indies, but I'm looking at you, Rev Pro. The point of all this though is that it ties into something about Dynasty that I love so much, something that I mentioned earlier. The variety of styles and matches on that show were so great. There was only one match out of the 9 that went below 15 minutes, and I didn't feel a single second of it. All 9 matches were distinct and tried to do their own thing, which ensured that none of them stepped on another match's toes. I thought the crowd would legitimately be cooked at many points throughout the show, but they stood strong, and I think a lot of that is due to that variety. If you're seeing so many different things in so many different ways and different stories every time, it's gonna be more engaging to watch. I genuinely think that's a huge reason why Dynasty was so great, and it's something that I hope to see continued in the future. Because when these extremely long shows are structured that well, the 4 hours just flies by. Looking into the future, I think that Double or Nothing is already shaping up to be as good as Dynasty was somehow. And going back earlier than that, as good as Revolution was somehow. At the end of the day, I think the title of this video proves to be objective fact every time they do run a pay-per-view. There was a time where I think you could have said otherwise, but after what we've seen for nearly 5 years now, I don't think there's any argument to be made anymore. These shows are considered weak if they're a 7 to 8 out of 10, which tells you I think all you need to know. When done as well as Dynasty was, pay-per-views are very easily AEW's biggest strength, and I don't think that's going to change for quite some time. That's going to do it for today's video, everybody. Make sure to like the video and subscribe to the channel. We're very close to 500 subs, so I'd love to get there ASAP. And also comment down below what you love and what you don't about AEW pay-per-views overall. I'd love to hear what you have to say. Thank you all so much for watching. It's been Novi. Much love. Peace.